first thing that strikes me about the 2021 vintage, having just been there last week to taste it, is how much better it was than expectation. Following what was widely reported as a really difficult growing season, there was a spell of warm weather towards the end of August, which essentially saved the harvest. I was expecting a lot of green tannin, a lot of hard wines, not so much alcohol because we knew it had been cool, but a lack of balance essentially. Almost universally at the top level, the wines were really quite attractive. And I think the slightly lower alcohol levels and the slightly higher acidity, but not in a sense that it wasn't balanced, just created a freshness that was welcome as well as a relief in relation to tasting young wines.
So the 2021 vintage, it's definitely a vintage for the vignerons. It was a challenging growing season, so it was all about the decisions made by the winemakers to overcome the various challenges they faced. They had, for example, early bud break, they had frosts, they had mildew, they had really heavy rains, much higher than the average during May and June. So it was about the decisions the winemakers took in those moments to overcome the toughness of the vintage. I think overall, it's quite a heterogeneous vintage, meaning that it's quite a mixed bag. So it varies a lot from commune to commune and even property to property. So it's difficult to generalize about the vintage on the whole.
I think really just to reiterate that this is a vintage with some really excellent wines that are quite classically styled. So this is really a vintage for lovers of more traditional Bordeaux style. This isn't a blockbuster vintage, but there's some really lovely wines. They'll offer some great, relatively early drinking pleasure. And my advice would really be, because the wines aren't quite as consistent as we've seen in something like 2019, would be to read up, follow our recommendations, read critical reports, and choose carefully. But there'll be some very rewarding buys in 2020.